So I'm going to read out the question, and then whoever is ready to answer can answer. Okay? So the first one is this. I'd love to hear ideas about how to make contacts with locals in estate ministry when you move in.
Go on, Grace.
Sure, I'll go. So I think it's good just to think about things that you're interested in, things that you're good at. Often it's the case that in the sorts of communities that we work, there are lots of community groups and different things going on. So if there's something that kind of takes your fancy, join one of those. So for example, when I moved to Everton, there was a social enterprise bakery that had just started. And I love to bake, so just went down and I said, oh, can I help? And then I was able to go in once a week and bake for a couple of hours. And then they let me set up a cake club. So just met with people once a month and sort of ate cake and chatted. And that was just a really good way to get to know lots of non-Christians in the area. And it was great as well, because it was something that I enjoyed. Things like sports clubs as well. So we had a little WhatsApp group between some women that I got to know, and we'd just sort of go for park run on Saturday mornings. And then maybe just a bit out of your comfort zone. So this kind of happened a year or so after I'd joined the church, but that we just noticed there was a gap in provision for mums and little young children. So we set up a toddler group, and that was the best way really to get to know women in our area. And when we were thinking about setting it up, I'm not very good with children. It's not really my thing, but it was, I grew to love it, and it wasn't really about the kids. It was about just growing relationships with the women there. So just be creative, see what the gaps are, see what's there already, and get stuck in.
You got anything, Julian?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you got children, I was speaking to someone earlier about this kind of school gate ministry, and that really is a great thing, because definitely get to be getting involved in things that are already happening on the estate. But very often you get the same kind of group of people going to all the different things. There's different people that go to different things, but it's it's all out of one large pool. And there's on our estate thousands of people that will never go to any of the groups. And so the school gate is the one place where you can get to meet a lot of people that you wouldn't otherwise come into contact with. So that really shouldn't be underestimated. That's not something that we can do anymore because we don't have little children, they've grown up. Other than that, being involved in community things. And I think just the other thing is, one of the questions in your workshop was, do you take the short-term view or the long-term? And the great thing about being in one place for 20 plus years is you just grow up with a whole generation of kids that get to know you as someone that's just been on the estate doing stuff ever since. So through clubs and things like that, you accumulate the number of people you get to know. So just the long-term ministry.
I think stuff like when your car breaks down, that's a great one, because you got people walk past and ask them for help and stuff like that. That's a good way of getting to know people. Taking your kids to the playground, don't sabotage your own car. Right? Finding out what things are going on in the community and piggybacking on them. So if you can't afford to run your own sports day, is the council arranging a sports day that you can turn up to? Is there a local arts and crafts thing that you can join in or something?
Can I just add as well? Sorry, just really quickly, and door to door as well. And if that's something that fills you with dread, which it did me, one thing that we would do was just print a sheet of A4 with a bit of, it was like a newsletter of events that were going on at the church. So if someone opened the door and they weren't interested in a conversation, you could just give it to them. But if they seemed a bit chatty, then you could use that as a bit of a springboard for a conversation. And just through doing door to door, we got to know lots of people in the area, and they got to kind of see that we weren't kind of a bunch of weirdos, we were just normal people.
Just to add one thing to that, I don't know if you remember the old, I think it was Carlsberg advert, reaches the places other beers cannot reach. And And a lot of people aren't big on door-to-door work, but it really does reach people that no other ministry is going to reach.
I just would say with door-to-door, I think one thing we learned was we started off trying to make many contacts. In other words, we would belt down a road and try and, we'd go, right, we're going to do 100 doors today. And that was our aim. That changed then to quality is better than rushing it. So it's better to aim to have some good conversations with people, get to know them, than to cover a number of doors. So I think you don't have to rush around. I think the other thing is authenticity, because I think we have a problem with making friends with the intention of sharing the gospel with them, which is great. That's the thing they most need to hear. But the making of the friendship is often fake. We're only doing it to share the gospel instead of making real friendships. And I think that decision has to be made. So on door-to-door, I think there's nothing wrong with going with the intention to share the gospel. You're not necessarily intending to make friendships, but I think if you're making friendships with people, make friends, make real friendships, and then share the gospel within that, if you know what I mean. So there's an authenticity thing. I think too, there's a problem with either the keen bunch, who seem to be the enthusiasts in the church, or just the leadership teams, who seem to be the people on whom the responsibility for making contacts rests most. The assumption is that we're the ones making contacts. And I think this is a disaster. I think one of the great weaknesses of the churches I've been in is that the regular members are not themselves making contacts. So that whenever we had an event or two, and who could you bring along, people just don't have contacts. So it's encouraging everybody, every member of the church to be contact makers, I think. Second question. How important is it to live on the estate you're trying to reach? How much impact can you realistically make if you aren't close enough or living in the estate?
I'm going to answer because you guys are really polite and I know we're going to run out of time. So I don't think it is that important to live on the estate, and I do think it's really important to live on the estate. But the key thing is, are you on the estate? Do you have contact with the estate? So on my estate, there's people that haven't lived on the estate for years, but they turn up every Sunday to the estate and everyone knows them and they have so much influence. So I think it's really important for some people to be living on your estate, because people need to be able to get to you quickly, and people aren't going to come around your yard if you live a 20-minute drive away, okay? So that is important, but you are going to have some people in your church who don't live on the estate for whatever reason. And if they're there every Sunday and they're proper involved in the community, they can make a massive difference. So I think yes and no.
I would just say it's an advantage if you want to get to know people living on the estate. It's always going to be an advantage. But the thing is, the role's going to be different. When we first started out, we said, if you're going to be part of this church, you have to live on the estate. We wanted to start with a core group of 25. We ended up with 8. But if you're not living on the estate, you're not so likely to be making contact with people. But you do have, as Duncan said, a role to play in helping a community exist on that estate, without which there would be no community, there would be no church. But if you live on the estate, you're going to come into contact with local people a lot more, obviously.
Yes. Okay. What are the panel's thoughts and experiences of using scripture or traditional evangelism out on the street in a postmodern 21st century culture?
Go on, Grace.
I think my only thought on this is hopefully any kind of gospel conversation comes out of the context of a pre-formed relationship. So one thing that we did up in Everton was just on a Monday morning, we'd be out on the high street giving out tea and coffee. We had a sign saying that we were the church, and we were able to get into conversations with people, just hear their story and then share scripture that way. or kind of get to know people through different groups, and then over time share scripture. So it kind of was out of the context of a relationship where people knew that we loved them, that we weren't just kind of chucking hard truths at them and leaving it there, but we could follow up with them and kind of unpick anything that was hard for them to hear.
And Grace, I think that's so special what you shared, because of your own admission, you would find it hard to be in a situation where you're told, right, go up to that person on the high street and share the gospel with them, right? But through that whole tea and coffee type thing, then you felt you were in an area, a zone where you could actually then naturally, it would come up and share the gospel in that way, which I think is great, because then it's not like you being forced to be a square peg in a round hole or whatever.
Yeah. And some people might be happy to kind of stand there and kind of preach the gospel. That's not me. Some of you, that might be your strength. But yeah, I guess it's just kind of doing whatever works best for you.
I think that sort of traditional methods or whatever, I remember hearing a guy called John Hosea who'd been in ministry for over 40 years, and it was his last message he was speaking to a group of pastors. And he said one of the things that he's learned is that the Lord honours faith over strategies and methods. And I think that's true. So personally, I wouldn't want to diss any methods if they're honouring to God. Then we're for it. In terms of like cold evangelism, there are some people that want to speak to a stranger. Occasionally people have questions they don't want to ask someone they know, but they'll ask a stranger where there's no sort of accountability or anything like that. So there are times when actually that is going to be God's means to help someone move along the way. So you just don't know. So if people are willing, you want to encourage people to think carefully, but whatever, I think.
So the only thing I want to quickly add is I think we always need to also be mindful that the gospel always comes in a wrapper. Like when you give out quality streaks, they come in a wrapper. It's not just you want chocolate and you say, I want the purple ones, or whatever quality streak you want. And the same way when we share the gospel, it comes in a wrapper. So I know in my neighborhood, where I'm walking down the street, white guy, short hair, born and raised in London, I know that there's some people on the street that I have to be very careful how I communicate with, because there's some people that would think that I am going to be racist towards them. And so I have to be careful about just saying, excuse me, if you died tonight, are you going to heaven or hell? Right? Because people would naturally be scared and thinking, wait a minute, what's this guy about to do to me? Right? So if we are going to do very upfront traditional methods of evangelism, let's also be careful about our presentation, realizing that culturally we might be communicating that we hate the person we're sharing the gospel with whilst we share the gospel. So there's nothing wrong with the content of traditional evangelism, but just make sure we're doing everything we can to culturally communicate, we love you, we see you as someone made in the image of God, and we want to tell you the best news possible.
Nothing to add. Okay. Fourth question. It often seems harder to raise up leaders within a council estate context. Why do you think this is, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think there's all sorts of reasons. I think one reason is that there are proportionally on council estates more people who are from backgrounds where they've had no responsibility, no experience of leadership. And what that means is it takes longer. It can take longer to raise people up. Doesn't mean that they can't be raised up, but it certainly takes longer. And then I think the other reason is we don't look for people. We have a certain idea of what a leader, of what a budding leader should look like, and we can look for that, and then we miss potential people. So I think both of those factors mean that it's harder and it takes longer. We've tried it and things haven't always worked out very well, and just it's a struggle for us. But people can take on responsibility, but it can just, I think it can take longer, and you just got to be a bit more careful what you're looking for when you're looking to raise up leaders. Really, raise up people however far they're willing to go, as it were.
I got some bullet points I jotted down because it's such a big question. Matriarchal culture. Council estates, it is hard for men to grow in leadership in a matriarchal culture where normally the women are the boss in many ways. That is a challenge. There's a lot of character issues that us council estate blokes have that don't always get dealt with. And just for all men here, I just want to say, whatever issues you've got, deal with them as soon as you can, because in your 40s and 50s, those issues are going to become more prominent in more harmful ways for people. When you see these toxic leaders that are hurting a lot of people, it's often stuff that didn't get dealt with earlier. I think that a lot of church teams are saturated by middle-class people, which isn't a bad thing, but a working-class guy, when he sees in his church there's loads of middle-class people around, we just think, oh, these guys know what they're doing, you know, and we let you get on. We let you get on with it. I think. Oh, by the way, bye, guys. I know you got to catch the train, and it's been a blessing to have you with us. So, and let's stay in touch. God bless. I think the other thing is there's a lack of good examples. There aren't a lot of council estate leaders with good character that a lot of young guys are growing up watching and thinking, I want to be like them. Now, there are people, I'm not saying there aren't, but I'm saying there isn't a lot. So a lot of guys aren't even growing up thinking, I could be a church leader one day. Also, the other thing that happens is the guys that you are discipling in your estates, they get headhunted by Christian charities, okay? And there's good things about that and there's bad things about that, but it's just a reality. So you invest in someone and then you see a charity offer them a job somewhere and they go. And I know people are laughing, looking around the room because it applies to people in the room. And I'm not saying this with any attitude or anything. It's just a fact of life. And then lastly, insufficient training programs. A lot of the training out there isn't sufficient for council estate culture. And really lastly, spiritual attack. I don't think the devil wants council estate men to overcome sin, to lead other people to be like Christ. And I think every time the devil sees a man on a council estate following Jesus, I think he just lets him have it. And he just tries to take him out as much as possible. So I think spiritual attack. That's it.
That's great. I think the only other thing I might add to those are, it's not just the matriarchal society, it's also that there's a stigma attached to people who are perceived to be leaders in management, you know, among your mates, among your network. If suddenly you're a leader in a church, you're the other side, aren't you? So there's a stigma attached to that. I think the other thing I've seen is it's the way that folks deal with the increased level of sort of criticism, hostility, apathy, adversity that comes the way of pastoral ministry and leadership, and how you deal with that, how you deal with failure. And a sense of failure and things like that. So I think not necessarily got the means to do that. But that's all to do with training, isn't it, I guess? Great. Here we go. Next question. This has a preamble.
That's a good question.
So, you ready for this? Pinch yourself. Shake your head a bit. Get ready. Topic 1. Significance of theological training. This is what it's really about, theological training. Significance of theological training when working in deprived areas. I come from a church environment where many people get saved, grow in faith, get married, and plant a church without any theological training. Just good character, evident prayer life, passion for Christ and his word, and a sincere love for people. Having come out of that environment, I've now seen how common it is for men and women to go to Bible college. Question: from your knowledge and experience, what are the advantages of holding a theology qualification when working in deprived areas? And are there any disadvantages to having a theology qualification when working in deprived areas?
Grace.
So just speaking from the perspective as someone who trained for women's ministry, I chose to go to Bible college. This was 10 years ago because I didn't know anything. I was starting from scratch and I needed as much help as I could get. There weren't things like the Urban Ministry Programme and the BCUK Biblical Counselling Certificate that you can do now. That wasn't available then. I might have chosen to do that. So the advantage for me was just that it gave me just really solid foundations for dealing with difficult pastoral issues and just helping people, helping explain the Bible and teach it clearly. There weren't any disadvantages. No one particularly said, I don't feel like I can relate to you because you've been to Bible college. No one really asked. But I think the answer's maybe a bit different if you're sort of training for church leadership. So yeah, it's good to look at different courses that are available now, particularly things like biblical counselling UK offer, because it's a bit more, just gives you a bit more help in applying scripture to really specific, difficult situations that I found as a woman's worker. You kind of come across things like that more than kind of Bible handling and teaching difficult doctrines or kind of setting the mission statement of a church.
I guess, when you read the book of Acts, their first church leaders, most of them hadn't had any theological training. So certainly it can work. But theological training, if there's an option for it, is only going to be helpful to your ministry. It's not going to detract from it. And whether it's an advantage to have a qualification or not, well, I guess most of us don't go around with our sort of MA or PhD or BAs on a badge, so you don't need to tell people if you're qualified. So I can't see that there's any disadvantage really in getting training, as long as the training is good. There's some not so good places to train, and there's some good places.
Hey guys, I know I'm here in an admin capacity, and just catching up with the guys, I knew this question was coming up, and so I asked if I could slide in and just give a little bit of my own experience, having been exactly in that position. So I started out in ministry 20 plus years ago and was somebody who had a prayer life and a passion and, really was active in sharing the gospel and planted a church and was, endorsed to do so. So wasn't a Lone Ranger jobby. And then years in, felt like I was just drowning and needed upskilling and to get my spiritual weight up in terms of being able to face the challenges. And especially nowadays, we live in an information age, as they say. Google, Wikipedia, and YouTube will wreck your ministry and even your missional ventures if you're not equipped to be able to respond to the kind of random stuff that people can readily access. And so there's an even greater necessity for training, I feel, nowadays than even when I was struggling. In terms of a qualification, it's not really so much about the qualification, it's about the training, and as Grace said, there's better training available. But having said that, let's be real, in the evangelical context in which we live and fellowship, people do give regard to qualification in terms of it being a quick means by which they can assess your credibility. So, do you have a qualification and where did you get it? And so if that's of concern to you, or if you feel that you need to navigate in a space that that's going to help open doors for you, then it's something that it ought to be a secondary consideration. Because that's the reality of the world in which we live and the life that we live, even as Christians, that certain kudos can open doors for you more quickly than people getting to know you to establish whether or not you're credible.
Thanks, E. I think that bearing in mind, so like what me and Efrem and Grace shared about, there was a time where we needed information. And the way to do that was to go to a Bible college. That was a few years ago. The three of us were all at the same college at a certain time. But the thing is, that information that we got in Bible college now, you can get so easily online. And hear what Efrem's saying. Like, you don't want to be Googling, like Google all your theological questions. I don't mean that, but what I mean is there's like biblicaltraining.org where you could get the equivalent of a theology degree just online, just whilst you're traveling to work. and it's top quality stuff. There's other seminaries like RTS that have put loads of stuff online, and Westminster have put loads of stuff online. There's so much stuff online. I would say save your $9,000 a year to go to Bible college. I would also say be aware of the disadvantages of theological training. It's never taught in a vacuum. Your theological training can teach you certain prejudices that you won't even realize you're being taught. We see that now, don't we? We see how mature Christian leaders have responded so poorly to the Me Too movement. Where did that come from? That come from how people were being taught in seminary. There were certain prejudices that kept being put across about how the man is always the victim and the woman is always the Jezebel tempting the man every time. So those prejudices have now led to a terrible mess in the church. There's racial prejudices, there's class prejudices. That qualification also won't overcome those. I've found that if you're from a subdominant culture, it doesn't matter what letters you have in your name. Gatekeepers want to know, are you malleable? Will you be someone who will toe the line and do what they want you to do for their objectives? So don't think the qualification will do that, but what a qualification will do is like what E said, a quick shortcut for people to know if you're knowledgeable. It's unfortunate that's the way it is, but me, I only use my title doctor in the context of like my email, so that because I'm letting people know I run a training program. We've got to let people know I'm qualified to do that. So I put my teacher qualification in there as well. I put a few letters in there. And if I'm doing urban apologetics online, I want to let heads know that I'm Dr. Duncan Forbes, because there's people chatting nonsense, giving certain heresies at the urban level online, and I want people to understand I'm not just some bloke who's just got an opinion. I'm a bloke who spent years and years studying. I have an informed opinion. So I use the title like that, and I use the title to let the man them know you can become a doctor. Like, I need people on my estate, I need boys to know you could grow up to have decent qualifications. You don't have to, but it could be you. So I will use the qualification like that, but I've never found my qualifications have actually opened doors in my scenario.
The challenge to missional power as well, missional connection, and how you can become disconnected.
So, thanks, E. So really, E should be answering this now, but do you want to answer it?
Just real brief for time. There is a way in which when you go into theological training, especially if you go into a really long-established institution, you can kind of feel the need to conform in order to assimilate and fit in. And in doing that, you lose connection with your roots. And the culture of the estate, like they say typically, you can take the person out of the estate, but you can't take the estate out of the person until you go to Bible college. You know what I mean? And then it's leaving you. And so the reality is that you have to be aware of that so as to, like Duncan, myself, Chris, being in that environment, it doesn't completely consume you where you lose your sense of identity and sense of roots, and you're still able to connect and relate to people, and all of a sudden you're not talking about superlapsarianism and they're like, what in the world are you talking about? And you feel like you sound good, you know what I mean? And so, yeah.
At an Anglican college, you also get a frontal lobotomy and your spine removed. That's not true. I'm an Anglican, like I said. Well, I was. Yeah. I have nothing to add, except that maybe a part of that is language. So I think the qualification really helps, but it seems that people come out of college, particularly with language that you don't find in the scriptures. Jesus was able to communicate completely normally, deep theological ideas, of course, without having to get into all this theology language. So there's a danger in that.
But what was heavy, I loved in that question, was about knowing people who got good, godly character who go on to do ministry.
Yeah.
And I think that has to be like the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Like character, like work. Let's all work on our characters more than our theological education. I'm not saying at the expense of theological, but character has to be the biggest thing.
Which actually I had down as an advantage, because I think one place that you come under scrutiny is on some of these courses. Your peers scrutinise you and your theology and your character. and it's very helpful, whether it's residential or not. Okay, topic 2, ready for the second wowzer? Here we go. Preparing for inner city ministry. I'm a British-born Afro-Caribbean man and grew up in the inner city among various cultures, working class black, working class white, and British Pakistanis, for example. After watching Duncan's presentation on self-theologizing, I will now concentrate on championing outsider-insider mentality with a strong Christian identity. Question: does my experience of being born and raised in a deprived area give me an insider advantage? And do you think race is important when reaching the inner city? In other words, I believe that I can empathise culturally in a predominantly white working class area as a black man.
You know what? Do you want to answer first, and I'll follow up from your answer? I mean, I'm happy to go first. I don't want to, whatever you prefer, really.
Amen. So I think first and foremost, fundamentally, it sounds like from the specific nature of the question, the person has got quite a diverse experience in terms of their background growing up as an African Caribbean individual, and has had the joy of being able to enjoy relationships with people from different communities, different cultures, maybe all from a working class deprived situation, which I feel is much more common these days, especially, it's different for me than it is for my girls as young adult ladies now. They've had a different experience of that. And so, in one sense, get in where you fit in. I think if you have insider experience from the point of view of being in a deprived community, regardless of the ethnic diversity and cultural diversity, don't allow yourself to be boxed in. So, you're a black guy, and so that means you're going to be the voice for the black deprived community, because you might not feel that your experience represents that. But at the same time, don't underestimate the value of being relatable. And so utilize that as the Lord gives grace. But at the same time, don't rely on that, because the power is in the gospel. It's not on how relatable we are, fundamentally. The power, of salvation is in the gospel. And yeah, I think that was it. There was another aspect of the question, but I can't remember what it was.
Come back to it after you hear what I say. It might jog things I got there, Mike, here. So thanks, bruv. I think that if you've grown up in some way at the margins, that experience is translatable in different contexts where you're with people at the margins. I found that when I was in Albania. Even though it was a totally different culture, when I was ministering to people at the margins, there was a lot that I understood from my upbringing that helped. In general, people from subdominant cultures. So in Britain, you've got a majority culture, which is white, middle class. And then people sometimes use the term minority cultures. Some people don't like that term minority. It can sound offensive. Some people use the term subdominant cultures. If you grew up in a subdominant culture, you grew up in a world where you knew your culture and you knew the majority culture, and you learned how to play by the majority culture's rules. And that gives you cultural intelligence. So you understand a lot about cultures, and you can navigate. Like, one minute you're chatting with someone and you're like, oh, it's a mad thing. Next minute you're chatting with someone else and saying, oh, it was a mad one. Next minute you're chatting to someone and saying, it was rather difficult. And, and you just do that all the time, switching it up depending on who you're talking to, because you understand the rules of how cultures work, and you understand that you will put people off if you talk a certain way and all that. So I would say, from the experience you're sharing, you will probably find you're going to be a lot more flexible than some people would be. And so I think that is a very, very helpful thing. And I totally agree with everything Efrem said.
I think, especially from a missional point of view, and this is what I forgot, I feel that it's important for us to be appreciative, for example, of Julian's first session, when we see the bias of gospel ministry in the UK being towards the majority, which in some ways you kind of understand because it's the majority. But the reason RTU exists is because we realize that there's a lack of ministry in the deprived areas. And so therefore, there's a necessity for people who are indigenous to that as insiders to be mindful of that lack. And as God gives grace and opportunity to actually be willing to step into that lack, because as much as the church, you might have really kind of great relatability in the church and get on fine, people who are outsiders from a gospel point of view, who are lost in sin and their identities are bound up in their cultural experience, will look at the church and feel alienated. Growing up, that was very much the case for myself and my peers. Even though it was a predominantly black church, the culture of the church was far removed from the hip-hop culture that we were immersed in. And so we knew to go to church, we had to take off hats, take off trainers, take off shorts, and put on clothes, obviously, put on trousers and shirts and ties in order to be accepted. And so there was a cultural chasm there, and it made a lot of difference when we began to recognize that that's not something that's biblically important, and we could cross that gap in caps and trainers and give an environment to people for whom that was a real barrier to the gospel. And so if there are ways in which the Lord's able to leverage your cultural experience to serve as a bridge for the gospel into those communities, then pursue that by all means as God gives you the grace.
Amen.
Any more?
I think I would just say one more thing. That is, I lived all my life on council estates. So apart from 9 months, when my wife and I had a really nice place, not on a council estate, it wasn't for long, but lived on council estates. Now, having moved from one council estate to another, one of the key things that I've noticed is that I think when you're raised on the council estate, when you've been through the local schools, you are naturally part of a network that you can't get even as an insider going to another council estate. There's no replicating that. And so I think when you've been raised on an estate, it does give you a kind of an access to a whole range of networks that you don't get, even as an insider. But as an insider, you can still relate because you know what it's like to be part of one of these networks and that kind of thing. But still, so reaching people who are part of those networks on an estate is a massive plus. If they've been through the local schools, they'll have currency with a whole layer of people that you're just not going to have that kind of broad network. I think that's all I'd add.
And I think you've got to know the culture you're going into. So the rules that might apply here won't apply there. So I would say in Dagenham for a while, with the influx of West Africans into a 98% white culture, there was a resistance to anyone of colour. Didn't matter who you were, whether you're British-born, Afro-Caribbean or not. Whereas in a different situation, you might be more relatable. So you've got to know the culture you're going into well. I think that. Last question. My heart is for others leaving prisons and wanting to help lead people to Christ, as I'm sure you know a lot of people are placed within council estates after release. So my question is, how can we as a church be more open and engaging with regards to someone coming out of that specific culture, and how can we best serve someone in that position?
I have answers, but do you guys have answers? Because I talked a lot.
I had a lot of experience in this, so I wanted to.
Efrem, did you have?
Just one practical thing, I guess. I think on a practical level, resettling ex-offenders is quite a challenging experience at the best of times. And so I would definitely suggest don't be shy to plug into agencies and services that are already existing. Very often we kind of feel like we've got to do it all as the church because we want to give them the gospel and we want to kind of have be the center of their support and their help. But actually, we are blessed to live in quite a well-resourced, well, depending on where you are, welfare, I was going to say, sort of state, if you like, in terms of agencies and organizations, charities and government agencies that are there to help people in that situation. And so sometimes being somebody who's going to walk alongside that person and help them when they're feeling, low, demotivated, feeling like they're worthless, to say, nah, cool, look, let's go together and see what's there for you, is going to be as much of a practical support to them and give opportunity to the gospel as it would by saying, oh, our church is a welcoming place. That's a whole nother conversation, which may be bigger than what we can tackle in this short question. But for me, I thought that was really important to just highlight utilizing agencies in that sense.
Big question. So I think first 24 hours is crucial. You can literally pick someone up from prison and take them to a place you've arranged for them, and they say, can I just stop by at my place to get some clothes? And you park the car, and as you're parking, you see everyone waving at the person in the car and everyone greeting them in the street, and they go indoors and you don't see them again because sometimes the lifestyle someone's coming from is so difficult. So I say the first 24 hours, first 48 hours are crucial, and that requires prayer and being available for people. I say showing people a lot of grace so that people don't feel judged, because a lot of people are going to feel they're judged. And if you're someone who just can't ever imagine that you would ever be the kind of person who go to prison, I would just say you haven't had your buttons pushed the right way in the right environment yet, because there's certain life experiences you could go through where it's just too easy to go to prison. And ideally, as Christians, we should have, if we haven't been to prison, we should have the mentality of there, but for the grace of God, go I. And that means having a gracious church and changing a lot of sermon illustrations that keep talking about people going to prison and how people in prison are hypocrites because they judge pedophiles in prison and they're criminals. Like, we need to scrap all those kinds of illustrations. It's sending totally the wrong message. And also, I think, providing people with routine, because in prison you're institutionalized, you've got a very strict regime. Having a church life that can, or like Efrem saying, piggybacking off other services and that, helping people have routine in their life. And then the Bible. I mean, the first discipleship program I wrote was for guys who just come out of prison, come into a halfway house I worked in, and we just took them in depth through Romans, the whole book, like take them through Romans, and we had everyone, all the different types of crimes, going through the Bible, like you use the Bible.
Great. I think we're cooked, aren't we? Well cooked. So thank you very much, guys. Before we sing,